In your darkest moments, have you ever considered that death would be more merciful than the knife of betrayal? It may seem shocking to hear this from a Christian woman, but that's exactly how I felt. My name is Margaret Anderson. I'm 69 years old, and if you'd told me 30 years ago that my biggest nightmare would come from within the church and my own home, I never would have believed it. I was the exemplary wife, dedicated, prayerful, always with a smile on my face, even when my soul cried out for help. I grew up hearing that marriage was sacred, that a wise woman builds a home, that love endures all things. But no one warned me that sometimes what destroys a home isn't out there. It's sleeping right next to you. The pain of betrayal is devastating in itself. Now imagine it coming from the man who prayed with you, who preached about fidelity, who was respected by all as a pillar of faith. It was at that moment that my faith wavered. I found myself alone, judged, silenced. And you know what was hardest? It wasn't the abandonment itself. It was the silence. It was the suspicious looks of the sisters at church. It was the whispered advice in the hallway. Stay strong, sister. Forgive. Don't expose. As if the mistake had been mine. As if being betrayed were synonymous with spiritual failure. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt guilty for pain you didn't cause? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This isn't just a story about adultery. It's about how faith can be used as a prison or as a path to liberation, about how, behind many church pews, there are women who are hurt but silenced. And if you've ever felt small, invisible, or too guilty to share your experience, maybe this is where your story begins to change. Because that day, when I looked at my reflection and said, I would rather be a widow than cheated on, I had no idea what God was yet to reveal to me. We met in the church youth group. He was the men's leader, with a firm demeanor, a soft voice, and a presence that made others pay attention. I was the apple of the community's eye, always smiling, active in events, caring for the children at worship, serving coffee at gatherings, doing everything with my heart. They said we were a good match, that it was God's doing. And honestly, I believed it too. When he asked me to be his girlfriend, I thought it was the beginning of a promise being fulfilled. We prayed together, planned, with purity, followed all the steps a good Christian courtship should follow. We were married 9 months later, in a simple but meaningful ceremony. It was the day I thought, now I'm safe. Our marriage seemed to be exactly what every young Christian woman desires. Prayer together, nightly Bible study, plans to serve together in ministry. He was respected, held an important position in the church, and always surrounded by people who admired him. I was proud, and I felt chosen, blessed, and honored to be with someone like that. You know that phase when everything seems to be going just right? The appearances, the gestures, the vows. Everything pointed to a life that, theoretically, would be sustained by faith, love, and purpose. But there's a hidden truth that almost no one has the courage to say out loud. Not every fairy tale begins with a kiss. Some begin with a promise of faith and end with a silence that screams. I saw signs, yes, but I interpreted everything through the filter of faith. When he withdrew emotionally, I thought, it's the pressure of ministry. When he became dry with his words, I told myself, he's just tired. My mindset was to endure. After all, I was raised to be strong, steadfast, to protect my home. And I truly believed that this was love. Continuous effort, daily sacrifice, constant prayer. I believed that if I dedicated myself enough, God would turn any failure into victory. In everyone's eyes, we were the model couple. You know, the kind of couple you see in spiritual retreat photos? That one. Other women sought me out for marriage advice, and even when my heart was already restless, I remained there, upholding the role assigned to me, as if it were my duty to keep that image alive. No one can imagine the weight of living behind the scenes in a relationship where you love alone. The impact of this goes beyond emotional pain. It affects your identity, your perception of worth, the sense of worth you thought you had before God. And, behind every smile I gave in the church hallways, There was a small wound growing silently. I didn't yet know what awaited me, but something inside me was already beginning to whisper that this beautiful story had cracks no one wanted to see. There were nights when I lay beside him and felt more alone than if I were in a desert. The touch was mechanical, the words empty, and the prayer, when it existed, felt like something memorized, cold, without real presence. But I was still there, still, believing, still asking God to give me wisdom, to help me be the wife he needed. Because in my mind, if something was wrong, it was with me. And that's how many of us learn to live, thinking we need to improve, give in, endure, until we forget who we are. And I know that what I'm sharing here may touch sensitive places in your heart. Maybe you're going through this now. Maybe you've already been through it. Or maybe you're seeing the first signs and still don't know how to name what you're feeling. So, if this kind of conversation speaks to you, if it somehow comforts you, enlightens you, or even confronts you, consider subscribing to this channel. This space is more than stories. It's a refuge for truths that often go unsaid from the pulpit. And each new woman who comes here and walks with us strengthens this silent but powerful support network. This also motivates me to continue sharing these experiences, because I know there's someone on the other side listening, feeling less alone, and finding the courage to continue their own journey. Because what we're doing here isn't just reliving memories, it's paving the way for transformation, healing, and liberation, one word at a time. And back then, even though I carried a heavy cloud within me, I still couldn't see that what seemed like faith was actually fear. Fear of breaking up, fear of disappointment, fear of facing the truth. Until one day, something small, almost imperceptible happened, and it was enough for the penny to slowly drop. I did everything as the Bible commanded: submissive, respectful, present, faithful. I prayed for him every day, even when he spent hours silent, even when he came into the house and looked at me as if I were part of the furniture. I would kneel, tears streaming down my face, asking God to mold me. Lord, transform his heart, but if necessary, start with mine. Because that's what I was taught. A wise woman builds, even when everything around her is in ruins. And I believed this so much that I became an expert at covering up cracks. I would wake up before him to make coffee, leave notes in his Bible, and organize everything so nothing would disturb him. He was the man of the house, the priest, the one who spoke with authority in meetings, and I, behind the scenes, took care of everything to ensure that image remained intact. The role of the Christian wife, silent and firm, was given to me as a mission, and I accepted it with total commitment because I believed that was what made a marriage last. This was the mentality that followed me day after day. If something isn't going well, it's because you're not sacrificing enough. And the hardest part was that, from the outside, everything seemed perfect. People praised us, called us inspirational, and that only put more pressure on me to keep that scene going. It was like living inside a theater where I couldn't break character, because if I did, everything would fall apart. And there was something inside me that constantly repeated, "Hang in there, it's just a phase. God is seeing your efforts." But what I didn't know was that there was a hidden truth brewing behind the scenes, something I never could have imagined. And yet, blindly, I continued to give my all, as if my love and prayers could prevent the inevitable. Over time, I began to notice small shifts in his attention. A more distant look, a poorly placed apology, trips to events that were once ours, but now became his alone. And yet, instead of being suspicious, I blamed myself. I thought maybe I was demanding too much. Maybe I wasn't being enough, not spiritually, not emotionally, not physically. The internal transformation that began to take place was subtle, but profound. I stopped looking at myself in the mirror with affection. I stopped recognizing myself. My worth was completely tied to his approval, and little by little, I began to fade away. It's hard to explain the impact of this in words. You wake up every day, doing your best to keep alive a covenant that only you are nurturing. And yet, you tell yourself that this is what God expects, that this is what it means to love as Christ loved the church. But deep down, something was already out of place, something that had nothing to do with faith or lack thereof. It was a feeling that grew silently, as if my soul were trying to alert me that there was something hidden, something that didn't match the truth I had always believed. And it was precisely this feeling, almost imperceptible at first, that began to make way for the revelations to come. But over time, something changed. And it wasn't in the scandalous way many imagine when they think of a marital crisis. There were no slamming doors, no heated arguments, no explicit accusations. What followed was silence, a silence so subtle, so well disguised as routine, that only after a long time did I realize how much he was shouting. It was as if, suddenly, he were there, but absent, sitting at the table, but distant, sleeping beside me, but with his soul elsewhere. The coldness didn't arrive like a gale, but like an icy breeze that gradually extinguished the warmth of small things. His gaze no longer sought me with tenderness. Conversations became automatic responses, and touches, once full of intimacy, became mechanical gestures. When I questioned him, I heard the justification that would become a pattern. Ministry stuff, love, I'm just overwhelmed. And I, in my pious innocence, accepted it. After all, he was a man of God, a respected leader, and I didn't want to be seen as the wife who hindered her husband's calling. The cruelest thing about this phase was how much it confused me, because there was no evidence, no scandal, nothing concrete, just a growing emptiness. And the impact on my mind was profound. I began to think I was too fragile, too sensitive, too demanding. I began to withdraw a little more each day, trying to avoid conflict, trying to preserve a peace that, in truth, no longer existed. My focus became on pleasing, not disturbing, keeping the mood light, as if my effort could reconnect what he had clearly already disconnected from within. There's a hidden truth that few women have the courage to admit. Constant silence within a marriage can be more destructive than open discussion, because it corrodes slowly, leaving no visible marks. It's like being in a house that's beautiful on the outside, but with the interior walls rotting, and no one knows. Sometimes you don't even notice. It was in this environment that I began to live with a version of him that was strange, cold, yet still disguised as a godly man. He continued preaching, leading meetings, and being praised by all. But at home, the emptiness grew. I wondered, where had the man who wrote me notes gone, who hugged me at the end of a service with his eyes full of sparkles? When did he disappear? And most importantly, why didn't anyone see this but me? These questions echoed inside me as I insisted on believing it was just a phase. But something in the atmosphere had already changed. I could feel it, even if I couldn't explain it. It was as if his presence was charged with an unnamed absence. I didn't yet know what I was about to discover, but the feeling that something was out of place was no longer letting me sleep peacefully. I didn't pursue him. I'm not the kind of woman who searches through cell phones, follows cars, or searches social media. I've never needed that. I've always believed that when there is truth, peace reigns, and when there are lies, time reveals them. And it was precisely time that brought the revelation. It was an ordinary morning, the kind when he left early for a ministerial meeting. He'd left his phone charging on the bedside table. That never happened, and I wasn't the one who touched the device either. It beeped on its own, with a notification visible on the screen, no password, as if intentional. A familiar name, a short phrase, intimate and completely out of place. At that moment, something inside me froze. It wasn't just jealousy, it was discernment. A silent certainty that that message was just the tip of an iceberg I never wanted to see. I opened the chat history. The words were there, with the date, time, emojis, exchanged naturally, as if that intimacy were part of their routine. And it was, only I didn't know. The person on the other end? A sister from church, someone who hugged me on Sundays, who once prayed for me out loud, who said she was interceding for my marriage while smiling with a soul stained with lies. I can't describe exactly what I felt. It wasn't anger at first. It was a sense of displacement from reality, as if I'd left my body, as if everything I believed in was being dismantled with silent brutality. The betrayal alone would have been devastating, But what crushed me was the setting in which it happened, inside the church, with someone who knew my vows, my dedication, my story, and, with him, the man I'd defended, admired, honored, and for whom I'd fought in prayer until the last shred of hope. It's hard to explain the impact of such a discovery. The mind goes haywire, the body trembles, the heart races aimlessly. And yet, sitting there on the edge of the bed, cell phone in hand, I had the ability, or conditioned reflex, to shut everything down, put the device back, and take a deep breath. It was automatic, as if I were trying to erase it from my memory before I'd even accepted it was real. But the truth, when it comes out, doesn't put you back to sleep. It changes the atmosphere. It changes the way you see things. It changes the woman you were 2 minutes before the revelation. In the following days, life went on, or seemed to. He continued with his schedule, his commitments, his anointed speeches. I pretended nothing had changed, but his every gesture, his every word, sounded like a farce. And then I began to notice details I'd previously ignored. His excessive care with his cell phone, his mood swings, his recurring delays, the trips he claimed were leadership stuff. These were the behind-the-scenes details of a double life, hidden under the cloak of spirituality. And the cruelest thing was realizing that, for him, all of this was perfectly justifiable, as if his position, his reputation, and his biblical knowledge were a license to play with the truth. It was at that moment that something inside me began to break. Not destructively, but surgically, painfully, inevitably. It was as if God were opening my eyes to something I never wanted to see. And with this opening came the responsibility to decide. Continue to ignore it? Face it head on? Silence in shame? Cry out for justice? No answer came easily, because this wasn't just adultery. It was the deconstruction of a life built on an ideal that I now knew wasn't real. And with each passing day, it became clearer that this wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was an entire system of lies, woven together strategically and coldly. That night, alone in the bathroom, leaning against the door with the lights off, I whispered something I never thought would come out of my mouth. Lord, it would have been easier if he had died. And it wasn't a desire for tragedy. It wasn't revenge nor anger. It was pure, raw, unfiltered pain. I said it because, deep down, if he had disappeared from my life, I would still have something to hold on to. Love, honor, sweet memories. I could say he was a good man, who fought, who loved me until the end. But the betrayal ripped that away from me. It left me with tarnished memories, with doubts about everything I'd experienced. It even took away my right to miss him without hurting myself. There was something cruelly symbolic in that moment. The woman who always prayed in her bedroom was now on her knees in the bathroom, hidden, trying to hold back her sobs so as not to wake the house. It was as if my faith was being squeezed to its last thread. And yet, even in this intimate darkness, there was still a soft voice inside me, almost imperceptible, saying, I am here. It wasn't him. It was God. But I confess that for a moment, I doubted even that. Because when disappointment comes from the one who should protect you, it shakes not only your trust in that person, but also in the logic of life itself. I spent days trying to rationalize what I had discovered. I told myself that maybe it was just a slip-up, that perhaps, with prayer, fasting, and time, he would repent. I wanted to believe in repentance because believing in cold-blooded malice would be too much to bear. But his behavior didn't change. On the contrary, he became more cautious, more distant, more skillful at hiding it. And this, more than anything, showed there was no weight on his heart. There was no transformation, only strategy. His speech remained the same, his church commitments continued as normal, and on the outside, he remained the admired man everyone applauded. And me? I was in pieces, performing rote tasks, smiling at services, holding trays at events, while inside I crumbled a little more each day. It was at this point that I began to face what no one prepares you for, the loneliness of knowing the truth and not being able to share it with anyone. Because telling someone was risking my reputation. It was messing with someone dear to the leadership. It was exposing myself to the judgment of people who didn't know, and perhaps didn't want to know what was really going on. It was like carrying a secret that burned inside me, but that, if revealed, would make me seen as the cause of the scandal. This is one of the greatest distortions many women face within religious contexts. Real pain is stifled by the need to preserve an image, a structure, an authority that, in practice, doesn't protect you. And in this process, our identity is slowly eroded. I no longer saw myself as a wife, nor as a woman, much less as a daughter of God. I only saw myself as the one who failed, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. My mind was filled with confusing thoughts, spiritual questions, and a weight I can't describe. It was like mourning something that still existed, but which I already knew was dead. And even in the face of all this, there was still something inside me that resisted, a spark that kept me from accepting that reality as the end. Something that told me that this story, however painful, still had a purpose. I didn't know what it was, but something inside me began to understand that this profound suffering was also the beginning of a transformation, even if I didn't have the strength at that moment to call it that. You think you'll be welcomed, that when you finally open your mouth and say, "I'm hurt," someone will embrace you and say, "We're here for you." But when I finally found the courage to speak, not to everyone, just those I felt were safe, what I heard still echoes like a scar in my soul. "Weren't you woman? Enough!" And it wasn't a casual comment from someone far away. No, it was from female leadership, from sisters in Christ. Women I'd comforted myself, seen crying at the altar, and looked up to. Suddenly, they became judges, not of the situation, but of me. There's a hidden truth in this religious universe that few have the courage to touch. A woman's place, even in the subtext of spirituality, is often reduced to a functional role. Be a good wife, a good mother, a good intercessor. And if something goes wrong, it's because something is missing in you. The logic is simple, cruel, and unfortunately, silently accepted. That's how, in the space of a few days, I went from being the blessed pastor's wife to being seen as the woman who, perhaps, didn't pray enough, fast enough, or be kind enough. These words didn't just come from one mouth. They came with sidelong glances at services, with awkward silences in the hallways, with the absence of invitations to minister. It was as if my suffering had made me impure, unworthy of service. The breakdown of my marital image, even though I hadn't caused it, seemed to threaten the image of the ministry itself. And so the easiest path was to isolate myself, to cast myself aside, to transform myself into a whispered topic, a name laden with buts and what-ifs. The psychological impact of this is devastating, because beyond the pain of the end, you carry the guilt of having failed in a sacred mission, and it doesn't matter how much evidence there is of betrayal. It doesn't matter if there was disrespect, emotional abandonment, or manipulation. Everything revolves around what you stopped being. It's a silent but constant judgment. And worst of all, it's often disguised as spiritual advice. They call it exhortation. But what reaches you is merely a disguised echo of reproof, a reminder that, deep down, you're not being heard. You're being watched. It's in these shadows of faith that much is lost. Empathy, for example. Discernment. Compassion. Because when religious structures override life, when image is more important than the heart, spirituality becomes a performance, and the gospel, which was supposed to be healing, becomes a stage where only those who can maintain appearances remain. It was there that I began to understand that my journey wouldn't just be about overcoming a broken marriage. It would be about rebuilding my own faith. It's hard to say how much this affected my mentality, because what hurt wasn't just the betrayal. It was the feeling of being alone among so many who preached communion. It was realizing that, instead of reaching out, they chose to distance themselves, and not out of overt malice, but out of fear of scandal, out of the need to preserve a structure that couldn't handle cracks. Because if they admitted something was wrong, they would have to reconsider other truths as well. They would have to face that the system sometimes hurts more than it heals. Still, something inside me wouldn't let me give up. I wanted to understand. I wanted to delve deep into this pain and extract some meaning from it. Because when the wound is so deep, to ignore it is to deny the chance for transformation. And I felt that this journey, however difficult it might be, would still bring revelations that would change not only my story, but perhaps that of other women as well. I didn't just lose a husband. I lost friends. I lost references. I lost space. And I'm not talking about physical places. I'm talking about belonging, of being seen as someone with a history, with value, with an identity beyond the pain. Suddenly, everything I was reduced to a label, the betrayed woman. And don't think this comes with compassion. It comes with silence, with distance, with glances that look away as if my presence exposed something many prefer to keep hidden. The truth that marriage, however consecrated, is no guarantee of sanctity. It is no seal of character, much less a shield, against failure. I began to walk among people who had known me for years and now no longer knew what to call me. Before, I was the pastor's wife. Now I was nothing, an uncomfortable presence, a living reminder that not everything is as it seems from the pulpit, that there are behind-the-scenes details that hurt, that contradict beautiful speeches, and this, for many people, is too uncomfortable to be truly embraced. Thoughts came rushing through my mind. If I had been more understanding, wouldn't he have looked for someone else? If I had dressed up more, spoken less, forgiven sooner, would everything be different? It's cruel how our mindset, even in the face of clear injustice, still tries to find explanations within ourselves, as if guilt were easier to bear than abandonment. And that's where loneliness within faith begins to form, when you stop seeing yourself as a daughter and start seeing yourself as a problem. I felt this when I stopped being invited to pray, when I saw messages being ignored, when I noticed that, little by little, doors were closing, not because I had done anything wrong, but because my suffering was more disturbing than edifying. The exposed wound wasn't inspiring enough, and without realizing it, people began treating me as if my pain were contagious, as if my presence threatened the emotional stability of others, when in truth, all I needed was someone to look me in the eye and say, "I believe in you." This absence was more deafening than any harsh words, because there's a kind of abandonment that hides beneath pious speeches, that says, "I'll pray for you," as a way to end the conversation. That offers a verse out of context when what you really need is someone who will sit on the floor with you, taking their time to resolve the issue, just to remind you that you're not alone. And even as I tried to slowly return, reposition myself, rebuild a routine, it was as if there were an invisible ceiling above me, a limit, as if I now needed to prove my faith twice as hard, as if I were marked. And I understood that this wasn't just a difficult phase, it was a profound transition, a rupture not only with my marriage, but with what I believed to be community. The impact was so intense that, for a time, I even thought that perhaps God was silent too, because if those who represented him were so distant, where was he? This seemingly simple question became the center of a journey I didn't choose, but one I had to go through. The journey of detachment, of internal struggles, of decisions no one sees, but which redefine everything within. The truth is that, behind the smiles of many women in the church, there are stories stifled by the fear of no longer being accepted. There are wounds hidden with makeup and amens. And there's a loneliness that can't be cured with a busy schedule or ministerial positions. It only begins to be healed when we find the courage to break out of our shell and embrace the truth of what we've experienced. They tried to silence me, with words disguised as pity, with advice that felt more like veiled orders, with that condescending tone of someone who wants to control your feelings in the name of peace. I heard, "Sister, be careful not to give way to the enemy. You need to release forgiveness. Don't spread gossip." But it wasn't gossip. It was my pain. And not telling them was like suffocating, like swallowing glass. It was like telling myself that what they did to me didn't matter. because bothering others with the truth seemed more serious than everything that had been taken from me. It's strange how a woman's pain still scares so much, even more so when she dares to put it into words, when she chooses to emerge from silence and speak out. I realized it wasn't just the adultery that bothered her. It was the fact that I wouldn't shut up. Because while I cried quietly, I was a victim. But when I started speaking out, I became a threat, and that was one of the biggest mental shocks I've experienced. Understanding that the system often prefers a wounded and submissive woman to a healed and conscious woman. And this has nothing to do with true faith. It has to do with structures, with behind-the-scenes situations, with the way, within certain dynamics, the truth becomes too uncomfortable to be accepted. I didn't want to expose anyone. I wanted to breathe, understand, process, share what was going through me. But when I opened my mouth, I realized that most people only know how to deal with testimonies after they end in victory. And mine was still raw. It still had blood, still had tears, still had anger. It was still too human to fit into a Sunday service. I've heard more than a few times that I should keep it to my heart. But who can bear to harbor so much injustice without becoming ill inside? I needed to name what I was feeling. I needed to break that invisible pact of silence that for so long held me captive. Because while I kept everything inside, I seemed more spiritual, more discreet, more believing. But that silent obedience was killing me in slow motion. And I understood there, amidst the emotional turmoil, that breaking the silence was part of the healing, that it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Speaking out was my act of resistance, not to cause chaos, but to reclaim pieces of myself that had been ripped away in the process. Each time I said, "This hurt me," it was like gathering up a part of my history that had been thrown away, and the judgment didn't matter. What mattered was finding myself again, rebuilding myself, because there was something inside me that knew, if I remained silent, I would be allowing everything to become normal. And it wasn't. It wasn't normal to be betrayed and still have to protect the betrayer with my silence. It wasn't normal to be excluded for speaking the truth while the one who lied was welcomed with prayers. That was the turning point. The realization that my pain needed to be respected as truth, not stifled as scandal. Because what truly scandalizes isn't betrayal. It's the woman who refuses to be complicit in a system that profits from the silence of wounds. And there, at that point, begins a new journey. Lonelier, more challenging, but infinitely more truthful. A journey where transformation no longer depends on the approval of others, but on the courage to remain true to one's own conscience. I began to question everything. And when I say everything, I'm not exaggerating. Because after the ground crumbles beneath my feet, even the sky seems distant. Faith, which once was a refuge, became a question. A silence between me and God that hurt more than any cruel words I'd heard from anyone. It was as if the certainties that had sustained me for so many years began to slip through my fingers, one by one, without me being able to hold on. And perhaps the hardest part was allowing myself to feel it without guilt. This crisis, this confusion, this dark spot where even the light seemed too offensive. I, who had always been the one who prayed for others, who welcomed them, who said, "God is good, it will pass." Now I was the one staring at the ceiling, deep into the night, with a heavy heart, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Was it me? Had I failed somewhere I hadn't yet seen? Was God punishing me for something? The mind wanders in these moments. And the cruelest part is that no one sees this part. Because on the outside, you're still there, living, smiling when needed, maintaining your routine, saying okay at the end of the service. But on the inside, it's war. And I know this is a more common reality than it seems. There are many people experiencing a silent crisis of faith. People who love God, but are tired. People who have given so much and now feel as if they've been left behind. What no one tells you is that pain doesn't negate spirituality, and that having doubts isn't the opposite of believing. Sometimes it's just what comes before a deeper, more conscious, more real faith. Except this process is brutal, because it dismantles, it confronts, It leads us into questions that seem unanswerable. And it was in this abyss that I realized something that struck me. What destroys us externally doesn't always have the power to separate us from what is true. Sometimes God doesn't speak because He's waiting for us to learn to listen without noise. Because the noise of others, and even our own expectations, can be more deafening than divine silence itself. So I stopped. Literally stopped. With the rituals, with the prepared speeches, with the attempt to appear strong. I stopped to listen to what still existed within me, even in ruins, and what I found there was small, but alive. A spark, a reminder of who God was to me before all this. Not the God of conditional promises, not the one who needs to be defended with catchphrases, but the God who knew me before my reputation, before my ministry, before my certainties. That's when I understood. It wasn't God who had abandoned me. It was me who was relearning to know Him without the filters I had created, without the logic of entitlement, without the burden of perfection. For the first time, I realized that my pain wasn't an obstacle between me and Him. It was, in fact, the bridge, the way He chose to find me again, without masks, without performance, without the obligation to succeed. This darkest point brought me revelations that no period of prosperity could. I realized that true faith isn't the kind that never trembles. It's the kind that survives the earthquake, the kind that rebuilds itself amidst the rubble, the kind that isn't limited to pretty phrases, but that endures the raw reality of human emotions and still chooses to carry on, not out of stubbornness, but out of love. Because despite everything, something inside me still believed, even without understanding, even without strength, even wounded. And in this fragile terrain, I rediscovered trust. Not a trust based on results, but on presence. In knowing that, even when I couldn't feel it, He was there. Even when my heart felt empty, even when my prayers fell silent, even when everything inside me wanted to flee, He remained. And this silent, discreet, almost imperceptible presence, that's what sustained me. It was like a memory the spirit holds, even when the soul forgets. The memory that there is a resting place, even in the midst of chaos. A shelter that doesn't depend on answers, but on surrender. And that realization changed everything, because little by little, I stopped fighting the pain and started talking to it, listening to what it wanted to show me, the hidden truths about myself, about the structures that surrounded me, about the kind of faith I'd been holding and which no longer made sense. This journey of transformation has no set end date. It's still in motion. But what I can say with certainty is that at the darkest point, where everything seemed to have fallen apart, something new began to emerge. A less performative, more alive kind of faith. Less collective, more intimate. A faith that isn't impressed by stages, but finds meaning in quiet rooms, in sincere tears, in courageous decisions. A faith that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, because it knows exactly where it came from and where it still wants to go. And in this silent journey, where the soul seems to walk among shards and memories, something began to gain ground within me. The understanding that it wasn't just my story that hurt like this, that this wound, though personal, echoed in so many other voices silenced over time. Voices of people who have also felt the ground give way without warning, who have also wondered where God was when everything fell apart. And that's why, if at any point this topic touched something deep inside, no matter how small, I invite you to share it. Not as a rant thrown into the void, but as a living part of this conversation. Because when you comment here, you share your perspective, your pain, your perception. You're not just putting words on the screen. You're shining a light on other journeys. You're showing someone they're not alone. You're helping this message spread, reaching those in need, opening space where before there was only silence. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated with you most. It could be a phrase, a memory, a question that stuck with you. It all matters. Because when we recognize ourselves in another, something inside us reorganizes. And I truly believe this space can be a safe haven for that. A place where even the most difficult words find shelter. It is thus in this thread of honest and sensitive exchange that we begin to rewrite what seemed lost. And it was precisely at this point, where the pain no longer frightened me so much and hope began to breathe again, that a new question arose, different from the old one that only begged for explanations. It was a subtle question, but loaded with possibility. What if, in the end, all of this is leading me to something greater than I imagined? It was one of those early mornings when the body begs for rest, but the soul seems unsure of where to rest. The house was silent, the world seemed distant, and I was exhausted. It wasn't just physical fatigue, it was an exhaustion that came from within, from the accumulation of so many unanswered questions, from the anguish of having lived everything with faith and still seen the ground disappear. That night, I cried differently. It was no longer a cry of despair, nor of revolt. It was as if my soul was pouring out everything it had left, the remnants of strength, the fragments of hope, the shattered dreams, the wounded pride. I cried until I could no longer form words. And it was precisely at that point, at that limit where logic no longer serves, that something happened. It wasn't a vision, nor an audible voice. It was a presence, silent, yet firm, invisible, yet undeniable, as if the Holy Spirit himself had sat beside me, not with explanations, but with a silence filled with meaning. He didn't come to give me answers, and strangely, in that moment, I no longer wanted any. What he brought was peace, a peace that didn't depend on reconciliation, nor justice, nor understanding. It was a peace that seemed to remind me that, even with everything in pieces, I was still seen and loved. It was there, on the cold, living room floor, between dried tears and finally lighter breathing, that something inside me began to change. It wasn't a cinematic twist. It was more like a ray of light shining through a crack. But that light, however small, was enough for me to see differently. And I'm not talking about seeing others. I'm talking about myself. About looking at myself without the weight of what they did to me. About seeing myself beyond the role of the betrayed woman, the sister weak in faith, the one who couldn't keep the home. The hidden truth I began to touch there, that early morning, is that some pains don't come to destroy us. They come to dismantle what no longer made sense and make room for a new structure, truer, lighter, more aligned with what God truly has, and not with what they projected in his name. That experience taught me that there is a kind of encounter with God that doesn't happen in the temple, nor in conferences, nor in religious councils. It happens behind the scenes of the soul, at the moment when you no longer have an image to defend, nor the strength to react. It's a naked encounter, without spiritual makeup, where faith isn't noisy, but intimate. It was there that I began to understand the difference between religion and relationship, between imposed guilt and offered grace, between a God who condemns weakness and a God who sits beside pain, unhurriedly, simply to be present. After that night, external circumstances didn't change immediately. I was still, the same woman, dealing with the same sidelong glances, the same absences, the same echo of silence in the church hallways. But inside, something fundamental had been realigned, a switch flipped. And that's when I realized that the true miracle isn't when God changes everything around you. It's when he changes something inside you, and that transforms the way you walk, even amidst chaos. Your mindset changes, the way you see yourself changes, and with it, the decisions that come afterward too. This silent yet profound transformation made me look more critically at many of the structures I'd relied on for years. I began to realize how much of myself was trapped in other people's expectations, in inherited roles, in unconscious repetitions I called faith. What I called being strong was often just an effort to be accepted. What I called waiting on God was deep down a fear of disappointing those who taught me not to question. And this awareness, albeit uncomfortable, brought freedom. A freedom that unshackled me from old cycles, but also opened me to a more authentic, more alive reconstruction, more connected to the truth of who I am, and to the God who was always there, even when I didn't feel it. This inner journey didn't erase the past, Nor did it heal everything at once, but it gave me something even more valuable: discernment. The clarity that some losses are, in fact, deliverances, and that sometimes God doesn't stop us from crossing the desert, because it is precisely there that He decides to reveal to us a version of ourselves that abundance would never reveal, a version less hostage to other people's opinions and more connected to what truly matters. It was thus, in this space between mourning and renewal, that life began to take on new contours. And the most surprising thing is that, as I allowed myself to exist outside of the old boxes, people began to reach out. People who were also tired of performing holiness. People who no longer wanted to wear masks to fit into rigid structures. People with similar stories, with different pains, but with the same desire to experience something more real. And it was in this reconnection with others, now from a more authentic place, that a new stage of my journey began to take shape. I discovered that being a Christian woman doesn't mean silently accepting everything. It means listening to God's voice above human voices. And that's when the true reconstruction began, not from the outside in, as they so often try to teach us, but from the inside out, from the soul to the surface. I no longer wanted to conform to the image others projected onto me, nor did I want to carry burdens that were never mine. What once seemed part of my identity, being submissive to the point of suppressing what I felt, tolerating what hurt me in the name of peace, remaining out of fear of spiritual judgment, now felt like distortions of a faith that was born free but imprisoned by layers of rules and expectations. The reconstruction began deep within, in small, almost imperceptible, yet profound details. That's when I began to honestly question what truly came from God, and what came from human traditions. And this movement, though simple, has a gigantic impact. Because when you allow yourself to ask sincerely, you also allow yourself to find answers that liberate. I realized, for example, that I no longer needed to apologize for feeling, that my sensitivity, my intuition, and even my anger had a place on the journey. God didn't create me to be a docile, ever-smiling caricature. He created me whole. And in this process of reconnecting with the woman I'd lost along the way, much began to fall apart. The fear of displeasing, the guilt of choosing myself, the silence swallowed in the name of reputation. All of this was being dismantled, as if old layers were being peeled away one by one. And what emerged, little by little, was a lighter, more conscious identity, more aligned with the truth. Not the truth preached to me, but the truth that God whispers when we are silent to listen. And in this silence, amidst the rubble of pain, I found strength. A strength that came not from spiritual performance, but from genuine surrender, from the certainty that God is not scandalized by our crises. He transforms them into bridges. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, saw myself with tenderness. Not as someone who failed because she didn't hold on to the marriage, but as someone who chose to live with dignity. And this, for me, became an act of faith, a new kind of faith, less about rituals, more about courage, because it takes courage to get back up after being broken, courage to rebuild your path with your own steps, courage to admit, out loud, that the pain existed, yes, but that it doesn't define our destiny. This shift in mindset impacted every area of my life, my relationships, my dreams, even the way I connected with God. Before, my prayer was an attempt to convince heaven to rescue me. Today, it's more like a dialogue, a place where I can exist fully, without masks. And that's when I began to realize something I hadn't been able to see until then. That rebuilding my identity isn't about returning to who I was before the pain. It's about allowing the pain to reveal who I never had the courage to be. And when you understand this, everything changes. You start making different choices. You start setting boundaries. You start saying no without guilt. You start dreaming again, but now your own dreams, not borrowed from others. You start inhabiting your own body with presence, with dignity, with lightness. And this doesn't mean everything becomes easy, but it does mean that, even on difficult days, You know where your strength comes from. It's no longer in striving for perfection. It's in the peace of being whole. There was one day in particular when I realized the rebuilding was taking shape. It was when a friend looked at me, after a long time without seeing each other, and said, "There's something different about you, a gentle firmness, as if you'd returned to your place." And I smiled, because that was exactly it. I was returning, not to the place where it all began, but to the place I should never have left, the center of my own story, a place where God speaks to me directly, without intermediaries, without noise, without outside interpretations. And the more I consciously occupied this space, the more I realized how many other women also carried silenced stories. And without me realizing it, my journey began to become a point of contact. People reached out to me to say, "I went through this too. I never had the courage to speak up. I thought I was the only one who felt this way." It was as if the echo of my voice was empowering other voices to exist. And this touched me deeply, because I knew exactly what it was like to feel invisible, suffocated on the inside, and yet still have to smile on the outside. In this movement of listening and sharing, I understood that rebuilding identity is also a collective process. Each woman who stands up, even in fear, inspires another to do the same. Each story told truthfully opens space for other truths to emerge. And so, little by little, we weave an invisible web of healing, a web made not of doctrines, but of humanity, not of dogma, but of empathy, where each scar is seen as a testament to survival, not as shame to be hidden. It was in this atmosphere of shared reconstruction that I began to see possibilities where before I only saw an end. Because when we truly recognize ourselves, life responds. Paths open, relief arrives, the right people cross our path, and everything that once seemed lost begins to reorganize itself with a new meaning. Not as a return to what was, but as the creation of something new, something that deep down has always existed, just hidden beneath so many layers. And it is precisely at this point that the journey takes on a new shape, more mature, more conscious, more aligned with what God has always dreamed. Yes, I got divorced. And for a long time that sentence hurt me. It came laden with silence, guilt, and an invisible weight no one saw, but which crushed me inside. I thought I had failed God, that my yes at the altar was unbreakable, even if it had become a prison. For years I hid behind smiles, spiritual justifications, and an obedience that in practice only made me sick. I told myself I was being faithful, but deep down, it was fear. Fear of being judged, fear of disappointment, fear of admitting that, even with so much faith, it wasn't working anymore, that alliance, though legitimate, had already lost its life. The process of recognizing this was brutal, because divorce doesn't begin with the signing of the papers. It begins much earlier, with every silent night of tears, with every hope that fades, with every solitary attempt to fix something that only hurts. And when the day finally came when I said enough, it wasn't an act of rebellion. It was survival, a breath of fresh air after so much drowning. And as contradictory as it may seem, it was one of the most painful and most liberating answers to prayer I've ever received. The hidden truth behind divorce is that it's often the only healthy choice when all other options have been exhausted. And no one talks about it in church services, prayer circles, or spiritual retreats. It's one of those topics we learn to sweep under the rug. But the pain doesn't disappear just because we keep quiet. It builds up. It corrodes inside until you no longer recognize yourself. It was at that point that I realized I no longer wanted to simply survive within a marriage that nullified me. I wanted to live, and live fully, with dignity, without having to lie to myself or to God. That's when my mindset began to shift. Guilt still tried to visit me, of course. After all, it had been my companion for so long that, breaking out of that cycle seemed impossible. But each time I remembered the peace that came after the separation, something inside me grew stronger. I remembered the relief I felt when I stopped pretending everything was okay, the clarity that came when I allowed myself to look at my story without filters. And most importantly, the presence of God in the midst of the chaos, not as a judge, but as a father who welcomes, understands, and redirects. It's curious how freedom sometimes feels like a minefield. We tread fearfully, look around, and wonder if everything is truly okay. But little by little, that place that once seemed dangerous begins to blossom. Lightness takes over, and you understand that what you once thought was failure was actually courage. Because it takes courage to break with what destroys you, to embrace unpopular decisions, to start over from scratch, even when hearing so many voices telling you should have stayed, and even more courage to continue with faith, believing that God still has plans for your life, even after what the world calls the end. Over time, I began to understand the spiritual underpinnings of that decision. Situations that previously seemed confusing to me began to make sense. People began to reach out to me, not to condemn me, but to say, I needed to hear this. And I understood that my process wasn't just about me, that my decision to leave was also, in some way, paving the way for other women to understand that they don't have to die to maintain appearances, that the gospel is life, not suffering disguised as obedience. The transformation happened in the details, in the way I treated myself, in the way I prayed, in the way I looked at my own story. Little by little, I wiped away the dust of shame and saw my journey with more compassion, with more truth. And it is precisely in this lens that liberation resides. When you understand that God doesn't love you any less for leaving, that He doesn't reject you for choosing life. On the contrary, He sustains you, guides you, renews you, not with fairy tale promises, but with His real presence in every decision that brings you closer to peace. This liberation didn't come all at once. It came in phases, in waves, on days when I cried inside, even though I was at peace on the outside. But it was genuine, and when something is genuine, it has the strength to endure. Today, looking back, I no longer see the woman destroyed by divorce. I see the woman who had the courage to listen to herself, who faced fear, judgment, loneliness, and still kept going, who chose herself not out of selfishness, but out of responsibility. Because there's a point in the journey where not taking care of yourself is also disobedience. And when you reach this point, everything changes. You stop seeking validation from those who never understood your pain. You stop trying to fit into expectations that have always limited you. And you finally begin to live with the awareness that freedom sometimes looks like rupture, but a rupture guided by faith, clarity, and a hope that insists on remaining, even after everything. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation spoke to something deep within you. And perhaps, like me, you're rediscovering paths, rebuilding certainties, and realizing that, even after so many ruptures, there's still life, and that this life can be full, light, and full of meaning. If this content resonated with you, if at any point in the video you felt welcomed or understood, then this space is yours too. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel. Here we'll continue together with honest truths, practical faith, and stories that touch the soul. And if you want to show me you were with me until the end, leave the following in the comments. This message was for me. This helps me understand that what we're building here has an echo, has an impact, and more than that, it has a purpose. Oh, and if this video touched you in any way, leave a like. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this connection here was worth it. Now, if you want to continue this journey with me, there's a video right here that complements everything we've experienced so far. Click and stay with me there.